Hi, I'm Steve Jones. I'm here today to walk through how to create an accessible modal. The reason why accessible modals matter is to give equal access to all users to modals, and a lot of times important information and important actions are achieved through modal, so it is paramount that we make sure that everybody can access those. This modal follows the WCAG 2.2 guidelines and ensures that the modal is keyboard accessible and screen reader compatible. In this video, I'm going to walk through the HTML structure, including the ARIA attributes that are used to achieve this, the CSS styling we'll touch on for a second, JavaScript, and finally, we will run through a demonstration. Let's start with the HTML structure that we use to achieve the accessible modal. You see, I just have a basic HTML document here, and at the top of the body here, you see that I have a button, and I have a couple classes that I've added to this that I can later on control this with JavaScript and do some styling. So this is the button, and we want to ensure that our modals are triggered by a button because it's an action. It's not a link or a div unless the div has a role of button. But even in that case, you have to, if you set role equal to button, there's certain considerations that you might have to make in JavaScript to make it function 100% like a button. So in most cases, you want to ensure that this is an actual button element. So further down, you'll see where we have our modal. We got like a modal overlay, and then we have the actual modal. And I want to touch on some of the ARIA attribute considerations that you want to use when creating an accessible modal. Of course, I've got a class and I've got an ID on this. This just helps me control this. And the first attribute here is a role. And I have it set to dialogue. And this defines this as a modal dialogue. And next I have an ARIA modal equals true, which tells the screen reader that this is a modal. Then I have an ARIA labeled by, and I've set that equal to modal title. And finally, I have an ARIA described by, and I've have that set to modal description. And those last two, those are IDs that they're pointing to. So an ARIA labeled by will point to the modal title, which is here, and it'll allow the screen reader to know that this modal is called accessible modal title. And then an aria described by points to the description here. So it matches this ID and exposes that description to the screen reader. Further down, you can see that I just have some kind of example content in this, and I've chosen to use just a simple form. So I have some form mock-up here with a couple inputs with properly labeled labels and a button to submit and cancel. And that is the markup. So next, let's walk through the CSS used in this accessible modal. What you'll notice first here, the topmost div in our modal is the modal overlay, and we've got it set to display none. And this basically just hides all the modal elements on the page. And then below that, we have modal overlay is active. And this is if these two classes exist together, then we actually set the display on the modal so it is shown. And we will do this in JavaScript in the next couple steps. But the modal overlay also has a little bit of a tinted background to give it a little bit of contrast when it opens. This is typically done with most modals, but that's up to your own preference. And then further down, I just have some standard styling for the modal header and content and the example content, the form groups that I'm using in here, and then some simple button styles. So we give it a little bit of a nice look other than just default HTML button styles. So next, what we'll do is we'll jump over into the JavaScript so we can see how to actually impin that class. But before I do that, I can actually spoof it in the browser just to test that this is working. If I add the class is active to the modal, you can see that it pops up. So stick with me and we'll go through the JavaScript and see how we do that. So now let's walk through the JavaScript it takes to achieve an accessible modal. In our JavaScript file, you'll see that we set up our constants. We actually initiate the modal And what this does is it triggers our binding event so that we can set up all of our listeners for our buttons and focus states and things like that. So let's go down first to the open modal. So this is, you click the button to initiate the modal, and this is the function that runs. And basically, it sets that is active class, and then it hides the overflow on the body so that the page doesn't scroll behind the modal. And then we set the initial focus, which is another function further down here. So when we click on the button, I just don't want to keep the focus state on the initial button. I want to move it over into the modal to help the user, the keyboard user along, so they don't click the button and they don't really know they got to hit tab again to get into the modal. I prefer to just shift that focus state to get that keyboard user into the modal right away. And that's what this function does here. So we also have a function here called close modal when, of course, when the close button's clicked, or in our case, we also have a cancel button, which is not necessary, but it's nice to give, especially if there's a form in there. So it gives the user or the keyboard user or even the mouse user the ability to click that cancel button. And then we have our method for checking if the modal is currently open. And then we can get the focusable elements. So why do we need to get the focusable elements inside of a modal? Because in a modal, a keyboard user is going to tab through the elements, the focusable elements in that modal. And without getting those focusable elements and then setting what we call a focus trap on those elements, the keyboard user will hit tab through those elements and then it will just continue down the DOM of the page. And if we've already opened up a modal and we've already frozen the scrolling of the body, they're tabbing through and they can't really see where they're tabbing through and they can lose context to where they were. What we want to do is we want to grab the focusable elements and then we want to set a focus trap. So if I hit tab multiple times, if there's three focusable elements in there, it'll go through those and then just start back over again inside of the modal and just it'll just loop within the modal itself until it's closed. So I will demonstrate that here in a minute, but I just wanted to explain that a little bit. So you can see our trap focus function here. This was our initial focus that I spoke about at the beginning of this file. But yeah, so you can see our function for trapping focus is here. We basically are just looping through. We're getting the length of the focusable elements and we're looping through. When we get to the end, we just shoot back to the first focusable element. So we also want to ensure that when the modal is closed, that we return focus back to the button that they used to initiate the modal. And we do that here within the close method. That's a brief walkthrough of the JavaScript that it takes to achieve this. And next, let's jump into a live demo. All right, here we are. We have our accessible modal up live on a web page so that we can go through and test it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on my voiceover. I use a Mac, so I typically use voiceover. So you can listen along.
Voiceover on Brave. Accessible modal. Brave. Window. Accessible modal. Web content has keyboard focus. You are currently on a web content inside of a group. To enter the web, open accessible modal button. You are currently on a button inside of web content. To click this button, press Control, Option, Space. To exit this web area, press Control, Option, Shift, up arrow.
All right, so we got notified that we are on a button that is a modal, and we can go ahead and click that. And I will note before I click that from a CSS standpoint too, that I do have focus outlines on all these elements as well. So it's important to make sure that we have visual focuses as well. So I'm going to go ahead and click this.
Dialog with 4 items. Heading level 2. Accessible modal title. You are currently on a heading level 2, inside of a dialog. To exit this group, press Control, Option, Shift, up arrow.
So the screen reader tells us that we're in a modal. It tells us how many items are in there. It read out our title. You saw that our focus actually shifted into the modal. So we have context to where we are. On the keyboard, I'm going to keep hitting the tab key so we can tab through.
Close modal button. You are currently on a button inside of a dialog. To click this button, press Ctrl, Option, Space. To exit this group, press Ctrl, Option, Shift, up arrow.
All right, so we got the readout that we have a close button here. I'm going to continue on.
Your name, edit text. You are currently on a text field inside of a dialog. To enter text in this field, type. To exit this group, press Ctrl, Option, Shift, up arrow.
So since we labeled, this is just an example. This is not necessarily part of the modal, has to be part of the modal, but I'm using a form here and I've properly labeled this input. So the screen reader actually has context to what that input field is. So we can go on.
Your submit button. You are cancel button. You are currently on a button. Close modal button. You are currently on a button inside your name. Edit your email. Submit but cancel button. Close modal button. Your name. Edit text. Cancel. Your email. Submit. Cancel.
So what I wanted to do was click through and see that we are trapping focus, and it's hard with the screen reader. But so
Voiceover off.
Let me turn that off, and we'll do it a little quicker here. So you see I'm focused on the button, and now I'm tabbing through. I'm going through all the focusable elements in the modal, and it just returns back to the first one over and over again. That way we stay within the context of the modal. So what happens when we close the modal? So let me turn my screen reader back on.
Voiceover on Brave. Accessible dialog with 4 items. Close modal but open accessible modal button. You are currently on a accessible voiceover off.
So you'll notice that when I closed it, the focus got returned back to the original button that we used to initiate the modal. I'll do that without the screen reader just so you can see the flow. So I'm on the button, open the modal, I lock focus. I can hit the cancel button, which is tied to the same JavaScript function as the close, and I return back. It's read out to the screen reader what the context of everything is, and this is our accessible modal. So just to recap, with a little bit of HTML markup, the proper ARIA attributes, some CSS styling, and a little bit of JavaScript, we can create a fully accessible modal that is accessible to all users.